Okay, thanks. So without further ado, Toby, would you like to lead off?
Thanks, Nigel. I just wanted to do a bit of ground clearance to begin with, and make the case for teaching the best that's been thought and written, without getting into who's going to define what the best is. I'm going to leave that to Douglas. But it's important, I think, it's an important distinction. One of the reasons the canon isn't taught, it isn't taught in most state secondary schools, for instance, is not because the teachers have reservations about what the best is and disagree with traditional conceptions of what the best is. It's because they don't think that schools should be in the business of teaching the best that's been thought and written. I mean, the priority in most community schools, most state comprehensives, is not the teaching of the best that's been thought and written, but the transmission of core values that the teachers and the educational establishment that they're part of believe is important. So they promote, for instance, multiculturalism. They promote tolerance of homosexuality, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not saying, I wouldn't for a second say that it's wrong to try and transmit those values, but I just want to make the point that when they're selecting what to teach, they're not thinking, is this the best? They're thinking, what's most likely to foster the kind of society I think it would be good to live in. So, for instance, give you an example. When choosing what to teach, when choosing 2 books to teach for English GCSE, let's say their first choice is Pride and Prejudice, and then in their second they've got to choose between Middlemarch and The Colour Purple. They would choose The Colour Purple to try and promote the idea, to try and promote mutual respect, mutual understanding, tolerance, and so on and so forth, not because they think The Colour Purple is a better book than Middlemarch. That would be a secondary consideration. So why do I think that schools ought not to be in the business of transmitting the values that the teachers believe society ought to prize, but why it should just be in the business of transmitting knowledge and fostering a kind of independent mindedness and ability to think critically and intelligently about the world? Well, I think for one thing, the problem with putting the emphasis on the transmission of values is that inevitably there's a political bias. Subjects like citizenship might as well be called Why You Should Vote Labour. And it's actually very unusual to find an attentive product of a community school at the age of 16 or 17 who doesn't think that voting for any party other than the Labour Party is wicked. And in that respect, the schools have been successful. They've achieved what they think the goal of education should be, which is to turn out Labour Party supporters. And I'm not sure that I think that should be the primary purpose of education. A good example of this bias was when Catherine Birbalsingh, the deputy headmistress of an inner-city academy, got up at the Tory party conference last year and said that the system was politically biased in favour of the Labour Party, and for her sins was summarily dismissed from the school she taught at, even though the executive head of that school had actually appeared on a platform with Tony Blair. I think the other problem, apart from political bias, is it promotes a kind of conformity. What the schools are trying to do is churn out citizens who they think are going to be productive and obedient. They aren't going to rock the boat. They aren't going to question the prevailing values of the larger society, or as they call it, the community. And I think that kind of conformity is dangerous in a democratic society. And in that respect, the schools are really no different in their wrong-headedness than the school in If, Lindsay Anderson's satire of public schools. Again, the aim of public schools was to turn out good citizens, conformists, people who weren't going to question the prevailing orthodoxy of the day. Similarly, that's what community schools do. It's a very different orthodoxy that they're promoting, and I don't think that's what schools should do. More importantly, the problem with not teaching children the best that's been thought and said, with not trying to deliver a classical liberal education, is that you place them at a huge competitive disadvantage when going up against the products of independent schools where they are taught the best that's been thought and said. What chance, really, does someone born on a council estate and educated at a community school, where instead of studying algebra, he's designing posters to promote LGBT Week, what hope does he have of competing with the product of Eton? And just one example, Westminster got more children into Oxford and Cambridge last year than the entire population of children on free school meals. And of course, children at Westminster have many advantages that children on free school meals don't. But I don't think that's the entire explanation. I also think it's because they've been taught the best that's been thought and written, and that gives them a huge advantage. And you're hobbling children by not teaching them this and rendering them unable to compete in the kind of meritocratic arena. But fourthly, I think, and most importantly, it's about imparting a gift to the child. It's about fostering the ability to think, the ability to transcend and get past whatever is distracting them in the wider world, the prevailing values which are out there, the ideological currents. If you teach them properly, if education does what it's supposed to do, you create a kind of independent space where someone can kind of retire and go and observe the world critically. There's a wonderful letter that Machiavelli wrote in which he describes the difference between his day-to-day life and his life when he retired to his library. And he talks about casting off his worldly garments and brushing the dirt off his fingers and communing with the ancients. And that, to me, is what a school should aim to be. It should be a place in which children can cast off the day-to-day distractions and commune with the best thinkers and the best writers out there. So I think that's the case for teaching the best that's been thought and said. And I'm now going to hand over to Douglas, who's going to explain why, when it comes to the best, there's the West and the rest. Thank you.
Okay, Douglas.
Well, I'll try to live up to that billing. Perhaps I can start this way, which is that I don't know how long those people in this room or tent have been at this festival this weekend, but whether or not they've had the same experience as I have. But a number of times in the last 24, 48 hours or so since I've been here, I've had the experience of speaking with people I don't know and discovering that we have common reference points, usually to certain works of literature, often to a work of literature I don't know or they don't know, but which we introduce the other to. And it tends to be that you find your way even to the bits you don't know via the bits you do. Say a less important poet in the Auden generation, a less important contemporary of Hegel's, or so on. And we can only do this because we have a way through the extraordinarily vast and sometimes in the modern world almost incomprehensible jabber that constitutes writing, speaking, and so on, a bewildering array of voices. I had experiences yesterday evening speaking to Don Cupid, who I'd never met before, never heard speak before, but who's one of my great heroes, I think, one of the leading philosophers today. And although we differ on all sorts of things, we have common reference points, common cultural centres. I think it's a very unwise thing for any culture to make itself entirely relative or not to teach something like a core culture. That phrase that I've just used, I've stolen from a thinker who I hope some of you know, Bassam Tibi, a wonderful contemporary German Muslim theologian and social critic, who came up with this term some years ago, Leitkultur in German, the core culture. And the reason why I cite this term is because I think it points to a way out of our current malaise, which is that Tibi says that the idea of a core culture is not that it's exclusive, but rather that it provides a central point around which all sorts of variations are possible. And I think this is the case in education. I translate it into a musical metaphor, if I may, which is that it's like a theme and variations in music. All sorts of variations are possible, infinite numbers of variations, but they're only possible if there's a theme. There's something around which they're based. If there isn't, it's all just noise, all just cacophony. I think it's in that direction, sadly, that we've been going in recent years. You know, one of the people who influenced me most, who I've written a lot about in the past, is Alan Bloom, the author of, most famously perhaps, of The Closing of the American Mind, but also editor of Rousseau and Plato. And Alan Bloom argued in the 1980s that if you weren't to teach children a canon based around a Judeo-Christian heritage, starting with the Bible and going through a whole set of other things, you would have to find a tradition which had as much in it and encompassed as much. You would have to find, for instance, a book as huge in its reach, as epic, with as many stories, as many ideas as the Bible onwards. And if you did, well, fine, and good luck. But most of the options put before people, I think, haven't equaled that achievement, that what is regarded still as the canon. You know, Strauss said somewhere that the thing about the moderns is that they're very clever. They built their tent on very, very wide but extremely shallow ground. And I think that's exactly what is happening at the moment, is that young people are getting a very wide array of ideas, but that they are very shallow. And you can tell that, by the way, in the fact that the things that Toby just described are effectively current trends. And that isn't to say that they're bad, but they are trends that have come very, very swiftly. I mean, in the last 10 years, in most cases. And that should at least trouble people for where the next 10 years would take such a shallow culture. And I wanted to finish on 2 quick points. One is the importance of transmitting the idea, and I think the canon is the best way of doing it, transmitting the idea that individuals matter, that history is not a process of economics solely. It isn't solely a process of class warfare or social warfare or anything like that, but that individuals matter in it, and that therefore the individual pupil can reach into the tradition and extend the tradition. And that only happens if you make it clear that the individual matters. It's the same with the teaching of history. The move away from teaching the history of great men and women it has devastated that idea, I think, of what the potential of an individual can be. Just finishing Andrew Roberts' magnificent new history of the Second World War recently, I was so struck by the way in which he zooms in on individuals again and again in the middle of these seismic, unbelievable, unfathomable events. He seizes on the individual, a young 16-year-old who had signed up early, too early. There's 9 months in the encryption of Enigma, which is missing. 9 months it goes silent. 9 months more and more ships are being torpedoed and lost to the bottom. But this young 16-year-old called Tommy gets off a U-boat that his boat has sunk, and as the crew are being brought on board his ship, he and 2 other men go into the sinking U-boat, get to the captain's cabin, machine gun the doors open, get whatever they find in it, take it back to the boat. He's the only one of the 3 that survives. And what he's brought back are the encryption books for Enigma and the encryption machine. And on the basis of that, after 9 months, we got on to Enigma again. He was given the George Cross and also discharged for being underage.
There was a Hollywood film about it, but in the Hollywood version, the heroic soldier is American.
Yeah. But I wanted one final thing, which is the importance then on this, just going back to my opening comment, the importance of resonance. That one of the reasons why the canon matters is that it has resonance, and that throughout your life you will pick up on references, on symbols, on ideas that refer back to great books and great works. And without that resonance, without having a core of great thinkers and great writers who you know and can go back to, it's not just noise, it's shallow noise. And I think that's a great shame.
Right.